And welcome back. For decades, the music and art of Violeta Parra have resonated across continents, inspiring generations of artists as well as activists. Parra's work not only fueled child's folk revival, but also became a cornerstone of the Nueva Canción protest music movement. Her life story reflects a powerful journey of artistic reinvention, political defiance, and personal struggle. Joining me now is the director and professor of Latin American Studies at California State University in Los Angeles, Ericka Verba. And thank you so much for joining us, and definitely thinking of you. I know you've got some adverse conditions with wildfires, but thank you so much for taking the time to be with us.
Well, it is such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me on your show. I really appreciate it, on your station.
No, I
Yeah.
appreciate it, and having an opportunity to talk about this wonderful book. And so, for somebody who does not know, as you are the author of this book, talk to us a little bit about it.
Well, I'm really excited to be sharing my work with everyone. It's been a long time coming, and it's actually going to be published on January 14th. So I'm very excited. um, and for those of you who don't know Violeta Parra, the first thing I would ask you to do is, Google her, listen to her voice, hear her songs, look at her tapestries because she's really a multifaceted artist. She did tapestries, she did oil painting, she did ceramics, she did sculpture, and she's completely self-taught. So she's no formal training in anything. She really her the highest education she really received was she did 2 years of teacher training, but that was really what sort of women of her time period. It was a safe profession for them to go into, and you started. It was like the equivalent of 2 years of high school, and then she dropped out because she wanted to be a musician. She's from a tiny town in the south of Chile, so pretty interesting trajectory. Uh, and just to kind of go back to the art she produced, which I hope you get a chance to listen to and to see. My book is titled after her most famous song, which is called "Thanks to Life," "Gracias a la Vida." Maybe some of you have heard it, and it alone has been recorded by maybe over 200 artists at this point, including Joan Baez, Omar Portuondo from the Buena Vista Social Club, Isaac Delgado, um, Placido Domingo, and Yo-Yo Ma did a instrumental version recently when he made a CD sort of music that could soothe us during COVID, during the pandemic, and he included Gracias a la Vida, an instrumental version. So just that's one of her songs, but her songs really have had an impact on generations of musicians by now. So
Yeah.
that's sort of a short introduction to who she is.
And yeah, and she brings some authenticity, and I'd say a lot of her authenticity is flowing through this art.
Yeah, well, she was a very stubborn woman. She sort of made a place for herself when no real obvious place was there for her. And she also had tremendous integrity. She was very political. She suffered poverty as a child. Chile, when she was in the 20th century and today, and it should resemble very much the United States, and there were incredible disparities of wealth. We're probably worse at this point, but so it was pretty obvious to her um, that this was wrong. That a few rich people shouldn't have everything, and everyone else truly struggling to get by. And so her songs are very much a statement of her class alliance, I would say, and her allegiance, and they're very much songs of witness. She described the country that she knew, that she traveled through, because she was also someone who collected folklore. So she traveled the entire length of Chile. And if you ever look at Chile on a map, it's a very long country. And so she just, and very connected. For that reason, you can basically travel by train the whole country. And that's what she did. And if I can give an example of one of her songs that I think is very, so emblematic, like it represents a lot of her songs. Her protest songs were all in first person. She's always there. She's the witness.
Mm.
And there's one song that she writes about the conditions of the miners in the north of Chile. And so mines are usually located, perhaps always located, in the most barren places you could ever imagine, because that's where the minerals are. So these are mining camps in the Atacama Desert, which is the driest desert on the planet. And she writes songs about the conditions, and the refrain of the song, the phrase that repeats over and over again is "Y arriba quemando el sol," which means and above this, the sun is beating down on us.
Mhm.
And so she describes the conditions that people live in. And what I really love also in terms of her songwriting is she always includes the women. She sees women's labor too. So she talks about the miners, but she also talks about the women in the town, the wives of the miners, who are standing in line at the only water pump in the whole town, right? Because every day to get water for your house, what you have to do is stand in line and fill buckets, right? And that's labor also. She never doesn't see that, which, in the 60s when she was writing this, many people didn't see women's labor, let's face it. And so she's the songwriter that always includes women. And also she always includes herself, so that the last verse of the song talks about coming back to Santiago, which is the capital of Chile, and telling everyone what she just saw. Right? That's the purpose of songwriting. That's the
Right.
purpose of her songwriting, is to tell people what she's witnessed in her own country.
And in her own kind of way, I mean, she really brings feminism to another level, right? And when we talk about today, we look at culture. A lot is based on identity, and really who a person is, and being valued for that person, and that value being, that identity being valued. She did that.
Yes, and I want to say it. She did it without ever using or uttering the word feminism. So let's be very clear.
Mhm.
It was because it's what she saw. So she's bearing witness, and she sees things probably different than other. I have to say, other songs from that time period, when they talk about workers, they talk about workers, los trabajadores, los obreros, right? The workers and their wives, la mujer, right? But she sees what the women are doing also, and I think that makes her stand out. She's the only songwriter at the time that's a woman, right? This is a time period when people are writing protest songs all over the world, in Chile, but it's the same. She's a contemporary of Bob Dylan, who I
Mhm.
think people now are talking a lot about, right? So it's I think it's her perspective, and then I think it's also really she doesn't just see women as a category, she sees working women. I mean, she's never it's really I want to say almost the ideology is like so embedded in her life experience. It's not like it doesn't need an ism to
Mhm.
follow it, right? It's really just she is oh, I know what one ethnomusicologist, a Chilean ethnomusicologist, what he described her as, which I really love. He described her as a social geographer, and I think that's a way to so she's sort of telling the story of the geography of her country, which is really varied, and she's telling it in terms of how the people live.
Do you think that she realized the impact internationally of her work?
Oh yes, she was absolutely determined. So this is a woman who, was fairly poor in her life, and for those people who in Chile, the middle class and definitely the upper class, it's almost a rite of passage. You have to go to the United States, you have to go to Europe, you have to go study at Berkeley, you have to, that shows that you're someone, right? Because Chile's somewhat isolated. It's in, the far south of Latin America. It's, it's got the Andes on one side, the ocean on the other. So people sort of to become part of the world, they all left, and she didn't have the resources to do any of that, right? But when she's already in her late 30s, she gets invited to these international festivals that actually the Soviet Union is organizing, called the World Festival of Youth and Students. And that's how a lot of poorer musicians and artists from Latin America end up in Europe, right? And she's absolutely determined to share her music and what she knows with the world. That is absolutely one of her goals in life. So she travels. The first time she goes to Warsaw in Poland in 1955, and then, like most musicians who end up in Europe from Latin America, and they're on the one side of the Iron Curtain, they all end up in Paris. After she finishes playing 2 weeks in the festival, it's not like Poland has work for her, so she ends up in Paris, and she ends up living there for 2 years. And she really, I guess her intent, her I think she sees this as a vocation or a mission, is to show the world what Chile is, who Chileans are. And so she that becomes a really important part of her being. And also, strangely, it's where she can be the most successful because when she's in Chile, she's just a Chilean, right? But
Hmm.
when she's in Paris, she's a Chilean musician, and that makes her um, different. And I have to say, it also makes her sort of exotic. So it's kind of also Parisians' love of anything that's not Parisian, right? You know, this kind of there's a colonial aspect to it, right?
Yeah.
Colonial gaze, I would say. So, but that is the world she lives in, and she has work there, and she doesn't necessarily have as much work in Chile as a folk musician. In Paris, people want to go and hear the Latin Americans sing, right? They feel like, oh, this is really fun. We should come. It's a pachanga. Let's
Hmm.
all go.
It's Paris, and
Yeah,
what do you
it's
think?
Paris too. It's Paris.
It-
Who
it-
wouldn't
it-
want to be in Paris? Come on. And
it-
it's Paris after World War II. And
yeah.
so one of the musicians describes it, he uses the French term, but there's no translation because it's Paris, right? He talks about the joie de vivre that people are feeling after World War II, because it's actually after World War II and after I mean, things are coming back into place, so people aren't quite as hungry and destitute. So it's just he describes this is the same. They're all living in the Latin Quarter, and he describes going down the street, and there's a cafe, and Jean-Paul Sartre, the most famous existentialist, is sitting there with Simone de Beauvoir, the most famous French feminist, right? And they're having coffee, right? This is where they're living, and it's all happening at once. So he's sipping his coffee next to them, and Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Nobel Prize winner, is writing his novel at that time in Paris, and actually to make money, he's playing in the same club as Violeta Parra. It's a club called La Scala, and all of these famous Latin Americanist, authors, artists are all playing music to just pay for the rent, which is always the maids' quarter on the fourth floor of these buildings, right? It's this little tiny room, and they're struggling, but the 100 Years of Solitude came out of that, so there you go.
And when we look at Violetta and we
Yeah.
think about her legacy,
Uh-huh.
what do you think that people will ultimately, or what is your hope that people will be able to take away through both your writing and both her work?
Yes. Well. Um, That's a great question. So let me start with her work, and then I'll talk a little bit about what it's like to write her life, which is a very, that's sort of a different project. But her work, Violeta died before Salvador Allende was elected president, and he was the president before the military coup. He was a doctor. He was the head of the Socialist Party and part of a larger coalition of leftist parties. They were elected. It was called Unidad Popular, the Popular Unity, and it lasted about 3 years. Well, it lasted 3 years, and then there was one of the most vicious military coups that happened in Latin America for that time period. Augusto Pinochet was put into power, General Augusto Pinochet, and he was one of. It lasted 19 years. It was a very long and very violent and repressive dictatorship. Um, and she didn't see all of that, but her songs and her music and her legacy were part of the whole story. So for example, under Allende, under this progressive government, there was a land takeover of homeless people. They took over land, they built houses, and they called their settlement the Violeta Parra settlement. And after the military coup, they renamed the settlement after some general to show how patriotic they were. They also outlawed instruments that were associated with folk music and protest music. They literally outlawed the cana, which is a bamboo flute. They outlawed the charango. Well, not literally. They did it sort of. It was an unwritten law, but everyone knew not to play these instruments. They killed musicians. They tortured musicians. Her own son was put in a concentration camp. And then, of course, there was a powerful and brave resistance to military dictatorship. And if I can show you how Violeta Parra sort of became a symbol of that, there's this one moment at the height of the worst violence. It's 1984, and these grassroots organizations that are organizing, they're not the political parties have been dismantled, they're illegal. They're the grassroots organizations. They're the people organizing soup kitchens. They're the people organizing people that live in settlements. They're the people that are organizing through the church for human rights, and they decide they're going to have a journey, a jornada, a day of unity. And one of the acts of that day of unity, or probably the principal act, is that at noon everyone will stop what they're doing and go outside and sing this song that gives my book its title, Gracias a la Vida. And you really couldn't arrest someone for singing Gracias a la Vida, because it's this very beautiful philosophical love song that says thank you to life for giving me my eyes so that I can see, my ears so that I can hear. It's all of the senses. It's my feet so that I can walk the length of my country and see it, and bring me, and it brings me to your house. And thank you for giving me the materials that make up my song, which are joy and sorrow, and it is also your song and everyone's song. And so you really can't accuse someone of politics for singing a song like that.
Hmm.
So, and it was, so it made it safe in that sense, and it was also safe because everyone was doing it. But that really gives you a sense of how powerful his songs have been, against, in terms of fighting military dictatorship. And right now at this moment, there's not a student movement, I think, in Latin America that doesn't sing her songs, or a women's movement. She's just become sort of the soundtrack, the accompaniment for movements for social justice in Latin America, I would say.
Yeah,
Um,
you're plowing in my field right here because I was getting ready to ask you about being that we are in 2025 now, and we
yeah.
look at the work that's going on in 2025, social justice, social activism, um, you know, standing up and making your voice count and be heard. These are things that Violeta really eh, she stood for. But
Yeah.
when you look at 2025 and you look at where her her generation make build that bridge for us between then and now.
I think the bridge is the same goals and vision for what we can and should be. I think that, I mean, sadly, I teach Latin American history, I teach Latin American studies, and I remember when I first started teaching, which I will admit was decades ago. Um, they, I would try to explain like the discrepancies. There was, people still talked about the third world and developing nations at the time, and we sort of said, oh, they're the ones where there's really, really rich people right next to really, really poor people. And there was this picture I remember, I think maybe it was Sao Paulo, Brazil, and there was in one of the textbooks, and it would be like a luxury high rise, and right next to it there were people sleeping on the streets. Right, it was a structure where people were clearly homeless, and that was like, you know with I remember when I learned about that, it was like, oh, that's those countries over there. By the time I started teaching in Los Angeles, people were definitely selling oranges on the ramps of highways, which means that you were living on $1 a day. I mean, $2 a day. How much were you living on when
Right.
you're selling oranges on the ramp of a highway? And today, it's exponentially worse, so that there are absolutely, I live in Southern California, and you will see a mansion and you walk 2 blocks from there and there are people sleeping under bridges. There's no we no longer pretend or hide the poverty of our nation. We look at it every day, and I think it's extremely dehumanizing for all of us, because eventually you end up walking past, perhaps in your daily life, there's how do we I, I- um I don't know what the I don't have a good answer to how we are. I know we need to fight for it. We need to fight for social justice. I know that's what your the wonderful station does, and I know that's what Violeta Parra does. And I would say that's the bridge. And I would say that what she saw as unjust, and what moved her, and what made her not just what made her shout. Her song says, "I have to shout." She doesn't say, "I have to sing." She says, "I have to." Tengo que gritar, right? I have to shout. What made her want to shout is not that different that what makes us want to shout today, in terms of what's happening in our societies. And and um and 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 I think that all people who that shouting is part of the activism. I mean, clearly this wonderful channel that you've created is shouting, right? And so I think that Violeta Parra was shouting in her lifetime, and that we still hear that cry, that grito, um and a book is so quiet compared. It's something you sort of open and read probably by yourself, because otherwise someone would bother you. And yet I think sometimes we need that kind of background and that depth as well. We need to sort of hear the human story behind who is shouting, to inspire us, perhaps to make us not feel so alone. And then also, I think when you're sort of confronted with this kind of creative genius that she truly was, I mean, there's also, for me at least, it provoked this incredible curiosity. Like, how does someone uh, get from the south of Chile, a family of 10, um, to write songs that are being sung, half a century after you're dead by people all over the world. And also her art was shown in the Museum of Decorative Arts in Paris. And she'd been an artist for like 5 years at that point. I mean, she was just so stubborn. She did not know the word impossible. That was just not part of her vocabulary. And the Museum of Decorative Arts, just so you know, it's housed in the Louvre Palace. So it is
Mm.
the Louvre. I mean, in Chile, everyone just said she was in the Louvre because she was. She was in the Louvre Palace. Her artwork was in the Louvre Palace. So, how does one woman be that kind of songwriter, that composer, and that visual artist too? So that was my curiosity.
Does your book actually, for a reader, do you feel like they feel the shout through through your book?
Well, people are contradictory. So she shouted and she also did some self promotion. I mean, ah, in order to be heard, she sort of had to invent herself as someone that was hearable, if that makes any sense. So there's the gender thing happening there. Her brother is a poet. It's a fantastically creative family. What can I say? So her brother is a poet, and he's considered a modern poet, right? But the option for women to be modern, really, I mean, she was. No one saw her as a modern artist. They saw her as a folk artist, as someone who was naive, someone who was instinctive, which was what women were, right? They were natural and instinctive, and men were inventive and authorial, right? They had the authority to be authors, to invent. And she really was never allowed to be that. She was like, people would describe her work to this day. They'll say, oh, she was like a wildflower that bloomed in a field. Well, that completely takes away any agency she had to create her art, right? What
Mm.
that means that she wasn't intentional. And who says that she wasn't intentional, right? And it's very interesting because she ends up in the Museum of Decorative Arts in Paris, which is an amazing feat, right? But before that, the person she first approaches is the director of the Museum of Modern Art, because she considered herself a modern artist. But she wasn't allowed to be that. They sent her over to the Museum of Decorative Arts, which is where you have crafts. And so in my book, because we know from her writings that she really admired Picasso, and in one article they're writing about her, she's being interviewed in the 1950s in Chile, and they say, oh yes, she discovered Picasso in Paris, and Picasso is the future of primitivism, right? That's how they describe Picasso. And so Picasso could use all of the same elements and be inspired by quote unquote primitivism, and he was a modern artist. And she could be kind of Picasso-esque, but she had to be folkloric and naive. She was the primitive, if that makes any sense, right? She was
Mm.
never allowed to break through and be a modern artist in her own right. So in that sense, she I don't want to say she gave up, but she certainly kind of acquiesced to this. She said, fine, you want me to be folkloric, I'll be the most folkloric person you've ever met, right? You know what I mean? She became a campesina, a peasant. She exaggerated certain parts of herself and not others. She
Mm.
created a narrative that I would say both fit and subverted what people were saying about her, or trying the way they were trying to invent her. So I guess it's a more complicated story than just social activist fights for justice. She also really had to find ways to overcome obstacles to even be heard, right?
And for yourself, obviously, a great deal of time spent on this work. You want readers to be able to get this and put their hands on it. So before we go, please tell people how they can get their hands on this book.
Well, I think the best, well, you can go to Amazon.com, which we have our own, feelings about. So if you don't want to go to Amazon.com, please don't. But the best way to find out more about the book, and probably to connect well, it's published by the University of North Carolina Press. But I have a website, and I have an unusual name, so it's my name. It's Ericka Verba. They forget the Kim part, but erickaverba.com. So, and if you go there, you can find out a lot more about her, a lot more about the book and why I wrote it, which is, a whole other story. But I don't want to take uh, um, more of your time. I'm just feel so lucky and privileged to be able to share this 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 wonderful artist with all of you. It really feels great.
It's been great having you. Great, literally hearing the story. And for those who aren't so familiar, and I have to admit I wasn't, but definitely inspired to learn and find out more. So thank you so much for sharing with us, Ericka.
Well, thank you so much. It's been really wonderful. I really appreciate it, Darren. You
All
have a
right.
lovely day.
Hey, you have a lovely one and stay safe. Again, thank you for taking the time. For
My
those who don't
pleasure.
know, she's out there in California amidst the fires,
Yeah.
and you've taken the time to be with us, and so we appreciate it and glad to have you.
Well, I appreciate the work that you do. Thank you so much for having
Thank
me
you.
on.
Stay safe now. All righty.